Okay, welcome. Assalamu alaikum. It is Wednesday, January 24th, and it is my honor, my pleasure to bring my dear friend Sofia Ali-Khan to this conversation around her book, A Good Country. Sofia Ali-Khan is a powerful anti-racist storyteller and a public interest lawyer. Her book, A Good Country, My Life in 12 Towns and the Devastating Battle for White America, was published by Random House in 2020 and won the 2023 Nautilus Gold Book Award for Social Justice. Writing at the intersection of politics, race, history, and Muslim America, her essays have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, Time Magazine, the Chicago Tribune, and other publications, earning her a Pushcart Prize nomination in 2022. Sofia Ali Khan's parents immigrated from Pakistan to America, believing it would be a good country. Equal parts memoir, history, and current events, A Good Country. In A Good Country, Ali Khan revisits the color lines in each of her 12 towns, unearthing the half-buried histories of forced migration that still shape every state, town, and reservation in America today. From the surprising origins of America's Chinatowns, the expulsion of Maroon and Seminole people during the conquest of Florida, to Virginia's stake in breeding humans for sale, Ali Khan reveals how America's settler colonial origins have defined the law and landscape to maintain a white America. She braids this historical exploration with her own story, providing an intimate perspective on the modern racialization of American Muslims and why she chose to leave the United States. So we'll hear a little bit more about that. A second generation Pakistani American born and raised in the United States, Ali Khan now lives in Ontario, Canada with her family. So welcome, Sophia. I'm so happy you're here.
Hello. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really, really honored. I'm a huge fan of the Muslim Wellness Foundation and of your work in general. So I'm really just very happy.
Yeah. Well, some might be wondering, why is Muslim Wellness Foundation having this conversation? How does the work around wellness and understanding psychological well-being directly tied to this conversation? And the Muslim Wellness Foundation is a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting healing and well-being in American Muslim communities. And our approach to health is interdisciplinary, is intergenerational, is spiritually grounded, community-based, and justice-oriented. And a good sort of significant portion of those conversations are about the stories we tell, right? The stories we tell about our own histories, the stories we tell to help us make sense of even why we're sick, why we feel so distressed, why do we feel so deeply and intimately, even the pain and anguish of other people's, right? And the struggles that they experience. So we're very much aware of the link between systemic oppression, wellness, and how communities heal and grow and thrive, right, despite all of those systemic forces. And we want to, as part of our exploration of psychological well-being, to really gain an understanding of how history operates, right, in that pursuit of healing and repair, and how we can draw on the stories to mine for, what is also joyous about who we are, right? Not just the stories of suffering, but what we learned when we continue to seek God, we continue to seek relationships with one another, and to celebrate who we are. So this series, in this conversation, is the first in dialogue that we want to have throughout the year, called the Home and Hijra series, exploring the beautifully complicated emotions, experiences, and memories connected to the places and people we call home. And we'll also engage in meaningful conversations about what it means to seek safety and belonging and community through the act of migration or through Hijra. Whether this migration includes a story from the American South or the global South, it really challenges us to think deeply about who we are, who we are becoming, and the values we strive towards in being able to imagine a healthy future. Right? We're in the year of an election year, there's a war that's happening in Gaza, there's a genocide that we're witnessing every single day. And it raises still those questions about who we are, who are we becoming, how do we understand ourselves sort of sitting and residing in the midst of, in the middle, right, at the center of empire, and understanding, right, that this place is also contributing to and funding and complicit directly in the destruction, right, that we can see every day. So we have to ask ourselves these questions. And for the Muslim Wellness Foundation, it is a way for us to begin to think about the process of repair of ourselves and all of that sort of psychic wounding, and also what is being asked of us because of who we are. What are the ways that we can contribute to freedom, to liberation, to harmony, and to health? So thank you again, Sophia, for being part of the first in our Home and Hijra series. And for everyone who's joining us, this is really exciting for us to broaden our definition of what wellness entails, where it begins, and knowing that it's not linear, right? But that's discovery and exploration allows us to ask deeper questions, right? And at times existential questions about what is happening in the present, but also in the past and the future. So first, I want to again welcome you, Sophia. I have some general questions that I want to pose to you. And I also want to give you some space to also bring in some of these new exciting insights that you have from your most recent trip to Umrah. And then you shared a little bit with me. So before we get to your book, I wanted to kind of ask you again, when you think about Hijra and migration, and exile, there were some things that were coming to mind for you during that sort of spiritual journey in Umrah, and wondered if you can share a little bit about that.
Course. So I'll start by saying that I just want to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional and the rightful land of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee here in Ontario, and I recognize that I owe a debt for being here. So this is a time when we're looking around and seeing a lot of painful forced migration around the world, particularly of Muslim populations. And so when I was in Umrah in December, subhanAllah, unexpectedly, completely unexpectedly, I found myself in prayer a lot, um, thinking about, praying about, trying to reach some level of peace around um, what I can and cannot do about all of this that's happening. And one of the things that occurred to me, and has occurred to me before, honestly, is that looking at the prophetic tradition, when you're on Umrah, you're going to the sites where these, these giants of our tradition, these um, prophetic figures have walked themselves. You're going to some of their graves. You're certainly praying for them. And I recently learned of a tradition, a Muslim tradition coming out of Spain, in which 6 women, including Hajar and Maryam, Hazrat Hajra, Hazrat Maryam, alayhi salam, are considered prophets as well. And I was thinking about all of them and thinking that each of them has a story of forced migration. Whether
Mhm.
that migration was forced by their people, by persecution, by Allah saying himself, saying, you must go forth, as he did to Ibrahim alayhi salam. So this is a story that's common between Abraham alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam, Isa alayhi salam, Muhammad alayhi salam. We have this story, Maryam, Hajar, we have this story over and over and over again of prophetic figures torn from everything that they know in order to receive a divine message and in order to bear a divine message. And so I found myself thinking about what it is about the hardship of migration, the hardship of forced migration and loss that readies a spirit for grace, to receive that level of grace. And part of it, I think, is part of that story is being torn from tribalism. In Ibrahim alayhi salam's example, we're told specifically that he had to leave his father's people, you
Mhm.
know. Um, and he's our model, right? We're told over and over again, when people ask you who you are, you say you follow the religion of Abraham.
Mm,
And so, you know, this is our example of how we walk with God. We do that in many ways in solitude. It
yes.
actually reminds me of that spiritual, you've got to walk that lonesome valley. You've got to walk it by yourself, right? Like I was actually ringing in my mind as I was at Umrah, which was the strangest thing. It was a little bit dissonant for me. Um, but that so for me, the hardship is for so many of us unimaginable. Being torn from where we belong, from our people, from our history, from the whole story that makes us physically who we are, the land that our entire culture is steeped in. That hardship is undeniable. But the question then is like, why is our prophetic tradition the same story of that hardship over and over again? What does it engender in human beings that that makes them ready to receive that kind of grace? And um, I think that's an open question for all of us, right? Like all of us who are in diaspora, all of us who have been displaced. The question becomes, what do we do with that? How do we receive the grace
Yes.
that might be housed in that experience,
Mhm.
in the
Mhm.
hardship even of that experience?
And that in so many ways, we're not considering or not able to perhaps in the moment know what the lesson is. So we have the benefit of hindsight, right, of centuries, right, thousands of years to say, oh, that's why, right? I mean, but even as we speak of the beloved story of Hagar, we know that in her beseeching was some degree of like, what is happening, right? What is happening to me? What is happening to my child? What must I do? Like this longing for clarity, right? And so we inherit that wisdom, all of these hundreds of years later, but in the moment we are sitting with the confusion and the pain and the anguish, right, of what it means to make these kinds of decisions that create a rupture. Um, and so I want to explore first generally, in the way that you are able, and I've told you this, I think what's so brilliant about a good country, is that you're weaving together the history of the places in which you reside with your own personal timeline, right? So we get this sort of zoom out to, okay, what happened here in 1600? And then what is happening for a young Sophia when she's like 15 years old? Um, and so I wondered, as I'm reading your telling of the history, one of the first questions that I had was, how were you able to hold those two streams, right, of the historical and of the personal? How were you able to do that? And in some ways, again, in hindsight, did it become a cathartic process, right? What was difficult? What was inspiring? Like, what were those moments like in the process, that you can now look back and say, oh my goodness, how did this unravel the way that it did?
So the magic for me of A Good Country was that the writing of it didn't involve device, right? Like I didn't set out to do a braided narrative of my life story with these histories. What happened was it was a record of what the process I was going through. So when Trump was campaigning in 2015, I was having all these conversations. I was ending a contract doing some civil rights um, consulting for a law office in Illinois. So I was kind of between projects. I was doing sanctuary policies for towns that were terrified of Trump winning and what that would mean for their residents. But I was talking to a lot of different people, a lot of different activists in different communities. I was talking to my Palestinian friends, I was talking to Native American friends, we had actually a conversation, and those conversations were pushing me because although I had never considered myself a good liberal, I was really coming face to face with the reality that I was a good liberal. I had worked for 15 years as a legal aid lawyer, and I was doing everything I could to work within that framework and believe that the moral arc of the universe was bending towards justice. And I think I was really, really attached to that in spite of having read Paulo Freire and lived with a bunch of hippies at college and had all these amazing friends who were telling me, you just don't get it yet.
Mm,
Resistant to that. And I, with a little bit of compassion for myself, I think that's because I'm the generation that loses indigeneity in my family. My
uh,
parents migrated from Pakistan, and my family goes as far back as you can imagine. Hi, Bilal. That's your son, and I'm so excited to meet him. Um, but my family goes back as far as you can imagine in the Indus Valley, as far as anyone knows. We don't keep great records in South Asia post Britain, post British colonization. But as far as anyone knows, we go way, way back. And my parents, I think you could still call indigenous. They have the language, they have all their childhood memories are there. That is still where they are from
mm,
in a deeply rooted way. And for me, that is not true. I grew up in suburban Fallsington, Pennsylvania, between Levittown and Bensalem. you know, and although I've been back and forth, it would be impossible for me to claim indigeneity. And the loss of that identity in my generation is quite painful. It's something that's really alive for me, for my husband, for others like us. And so the story of American exceptionalism was
mm,
the story that made all that worthwhile. We were coming to a good country, and that was the South, right? That's the sort of story you're pitched about how lucky you are to be in this place.
yes.
And so the rupture of that story and what I was seeing in the Trump campaign was actually an existential rupture. Like my whole worldview had to crack.
Mhm,
And I had to realize that the intentionality and the duration of the story of what America has striven to be, the sort
mhm,
of white America it's striven to be, that wasn't um, that wasn't something that I was dreaming big enough to change yet.
oh,
Um,
okay, okay.
like there was all the visions that I thought were dreaming big were not dreaming big enough to overcome what had come before. So
Mm,
this is the record of that. This is the record of me living my way to that realization
yes.
alongside the facts, the history that
Mhm,
made me come to that realization.
yeah.
So it felt incomplete to tell the histories that brought me to that place without
Mm,
telling you also who I had to be to eventually end up in that place.
yes.
So
So I wonder in that because you're saying just the loss of indigeneity and how painful that is, and that you need a compelling narrative, right? To in some ways to then justify, right, so much of the sacrifice and um what you're in some ways it feels like willingly, right, becoming a part of. How do you do that, right? How do you maintain your sanity? How do you make meaning, right, of those things that are almost incomprehensible
yeah,
in some ways? So I wonder, as you're stop.
I love that Bilal is joining us. I
Oh,
love
this is my youngest Izzy.
Is
uh,
he? Oh. Oh,
Yes.
Bilal is your
But
older son. Sorry.
but I wondered, like, as this is unfolding, right? It's not what you intended at the outset. Which which aspects of sort of inserting then your personal story felt like you felt ambivalence, or you felt like, should I, right, sort of make myself vulnerable in this way?
So many times, so many times, right? Because I
Yeah.
tell all the stories. I tell the pubescent coming of age stories. I tell the friction with my parents stories. I think my mom is actually joining us today. So hi, mom.
Oh,
So,
okay.
um, yeah, there was a lot. I mean, I went to my parents and I said, "Is this okay?" My father read the first chapter, and they gave me their blessing, which, mashallah, like that was enormous, right? And they've both read it. They've both read the book, um, and have been very, very supportive. And it's not easy to tell the story, to record the story of those painful moments that every family has, all those growing pains when you're bicultural and there are very different ideas about what a young woman should be doing with herself. Those are very tough times. And then, there's a very painful story of divorce. Um, and there are some, you know, we unfortunately are in a community where um, shame and pride and privacy are those are very they're big temples that
Yeah.
we all serve at the steps of. And I had to let a lot of those go and just say, in the service of telling the whole truth as much as I possibly can. And there are names that are changed, there are people who are protected. Um, but in terms of telling my whole truth,
Yes.
it, you know, I felt like for readers to understand what I wanted them to understand about these stories, not a bunch of dates and places, but
Mhm.
how it was affecting me and how it would affect me by the end of the book and who I was as a human being. I had to lay it all out there and I had to explain where the scars were, you
Yeah.
so they could understand what, how many of us are left scarred by these histories.
Yes.
Um, I was also, really trying to put into context the racialization of American Muslims. And
Mm.
some of us, depending on the skin we're in, have been racialized forever.
Right.
But the really racialization of Muslims as a whole, as Muslims, is a fairly new phenomenon in its vitriol.
Yes.
So Orientalism has always been there. The racialization of some of us has always been there. But this idea that we are somehow a sort of conspiratorial group of terrorists, that's a
Yes.
fairly new, and that is somehow innate in us. That is a fairly new phenomenon. And I wanted to understand how that happens after the civil rights movement, because the story of the civil rights movement is we're done that.
Right.
That's the story as it's told. And so
Yes.
I really wanted to understand how the blatancy, how the
Mhm.
blatant resurrection of all of those same old tropes
Yes.
was so we were so primed for it as a country. It was
Mhm.
so acceptable that
Yes.
we were allowing it to happen from the presidential podium.
Mhm.
I could not wrap my head around the story I'd been told and, and this moral arc that was bending towards justice, however gradually, and what was actually happening in front of my eyes. And um, so yeah, I really the book is really a record of that process of me cracking that open. And
Mhm.
you come along for as the reader, and I really, I mean, I struggled with how much I demanded the reader because these are hard stories, you know. Um, and I wanted, like, I went and revisited many of these places, if not most of them, because I wanted readers to be there viscerally with me. I wanted them to be in scene, not just reading a text.
Right. Right. So I wonder, it sounds like you were really intentional about caring for the reader. And I
Mm.
wondered in this process about how you cared for yourself. Because it's not just, well, I don't want to say not just, but it's the vulnerability, but it is also, you're doing somewhat of a deep dive into the origins of this country and what you discover in the midst of what you are currently living with, right? This is Trump election, and so it
COVID, actually, I wrote a lot of it during the COVID time. Yeah.
during COVID. So you picked the
Yeah.
easiest time in history to explore the most painful aspects of the history.
Yeah.
I wonder how you cared for yourself, or how your family cared for you as you, it almost sounds like you kind of turned yourself over to this process, not fully knowing where it would end or where the journey would take you, but you knew you had to go. So even in those moments, so I wonder, one, how you cared for yourself, and then how your family cared for you when they're like, oh, she's gone. She's
It was a lot of family caring for me. My husband, Nadeem, is, um, like he's from some other planet. I don't know where he comes from, but we would take these long COVID walks, and I would just be like, "You will not believe the story I'm writing now." And then he would have to live all of it, and read all of it, and then edit all of it.
wife.
So and then I also have an amazing neighbor, next door neighbor, and we would take the same long walks, and I would vent the same long stories. But it was really a community effort in some ways. Like my children knew that I wouldn't tell them the stories necessarily, but they would like check in on me. Mama, are you down there? And then when I was done, I wasn't sure I wanted to let them read it quite yet because they're still quite young. And so it came out in 2022. So they were 11 and 9. I was like,
Okay.
that's still kind of young. Still
Yeah.
a little young. My daughter read it cover to cover twice within the space of 4 weeks.
Oh my.
And, I think it really gave her a breadth of understanding, not just of America, but of colonization and what it means. And to be honest, I was terrified of that.
I would be too.
But there's something about being able to place yourself in the world
Hmm.
in truth,
Yes.
um, that just works for her. She wants to know the unvarnished truth. And I really admire that about her. And the more truth she knows, the more grounded she feels. And so at first I was going to write a young adult version of the book, and now I'm not. Oh, my daughter read it.
Varnish truth.
Uh, uh,
Wow. Um, so
it,
so
it,
I do want to, again, for those who haven't yet picked up the book, it's divided into um, these chapters where, you have a personal connection, perhaps where you were raised, where you worked, right? Whereas, a married couple that you, sought to make a place home. And so I wanted to talk about three chapters in particular: Princeton, Chicago, and Arizona. And in the Princeton chapter, you talk about segregation and meritocracy. One, I was just astounded by the amount of information you included. So for those who are interested, you can go to sofiaali-khan.com. There is a timeline, there's a discussion guide. It's really, really helpful. Um, but in this chapter 4, you include sort of an overview of Princeton, right, as the College of New Jersey, and the American Colonization Society. And that that section in particular made me think about, again, these conversations about, well, where is a homeland? Where do we put people when we no longer, we're so sort of uncomfortable with their presence because of the history, right, of how they arrived or how they got there. So we're just going to send them back, right? And so you talk about the American Colonization Society, and what it means to, one, the impact that it had on African Americans living in the country, but then those who go and it becomes modern day Liberia. And so I wondered there if if you have or did then kind of draw connections even between what is happening in Israel Palestine, right? And that it is once again the United States that is involved in this project, right? Of creating, right, something, carving out a state. Um, and that becomes almost like where we deposit all of those sort of unpleasant things we'd rather not deal with anymore.
Yeah.
Um, and and in that you also include, you were taking a class in 10th grade, I believe, in international studies, and the teacher says something of Israel Palestine. So I wondered if you can kind of flesh that out a bit more. Like, what is she teaching? And you recognize it, I guess, later as a very, very like benign sort of portrait she's painting, right, of the time. But this is also connected to the exploration of these projects, right, to carve out sort of homelands and states for people. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah. So I'll just say a little bit more about sort of how the book is set up. So it goes chronologically through my life. So the histories aren't chronological, but you're going chronologically from town to town as I move to them or as I go to them. Um, and so Princeton is where my family went to the masjid for the first time. The first purpose-built mosque in the region was the Islamic Society of Central Jersey. So maybe some of you know it. It's on Route 1. Everybody in the region knows ISCJ. It's it was an iconic change in what it meant to be Muslim in that region. People came from as far away as New York City,
Mm.
Delaware, and it was really a mecca for us. And that would have been in, oh, I don't know, let's see, probably when I was about 9. So that would have been 1983-ish.
Okay.
And so that's like chapter 4-ish. So there are 12 chapters in the book. I go to these different places in my life as I move, grow and move. And then I tell the story of the color line I tripped over. Then I tell the backstory of the movement that made it what
Mm.
it was, made the environment what it was, um, in terms of racial segregation and really expulsion of brown and black communities. Um, so in Princeton, I mean, I didn't know anything really about the American Colonization Society. I had heard about Liberia. I did not understand the backstory at all. And I
Mm.
certainly didn't understand that the American Colonization Society at the time was essentially a national effort. There were state colonization societies in all the states that existed at the time. And so I think 18, I want to say 18, between 1805, 1819 was when it started. By 1825, this national organization, which was counted among its members and its leadership, President Monroe, President Madison, President Jefferson. I mean, this was not
Wasn't a fringe effort.
this was not a fringe effort, right? And the guiding principle was, as northern states pass abolition laws and there are more and more free black people in America, we must get rid of them somehow.
Yeah.
It is not conceivable that we, the white people of this colony, America, are going to, this colonized place, America, are going to live together with the people that we tore from their homes across the sea. And and this is actually a story that you see over and over again in these histories. It's like, not only will we do this destruction, not only will we take home and culture and humanity from the people, but then we will charge them for it. We'll invoice them for it.
Yes.
So, whatever we think the ill effects of that process were, will make sure that they experience those ill effects themselves and pay for it somehow. And so
Yes.
the American Colonization Society was really um, this effort to, so imagine you have like the first two generations of free Black Americans who are beginning very quickly
Mm,
in the North to work, to find their lost loved ones,
mm,
to to buy property, however humble it might be. And it's like the first bloom of hope.
mm,
And the reaction of our national leadership is we must be rid of these people.
mm.
And so it's this like it's beyond tormenting
Yes.
to read the records of these meetings and to see how these folks were and what freedom meant on one side and what that freedom meant to these other people with
Hmm. Hmm.
so much power to pave the way to a vision for a multi-racial, multi-ethnic, repaired, reconciled society, and what they did instead. And so when in 1920 or 1824, the American Colonization Society begins to send boats to, first they wanted to send boats to Sierra Leone. Then um, Britain said, it was a British colony at that time. Britain said no. And they started to send, and the sort of discussion about where is this haphazard,
Yes.
almost careless discussion,
Right.
right? Um, and so what ends up happening is as these boats land in modern day Liberia, within the first 10, 20 years of those boats landing, um, 42% of the people who land have died. No, not 10, 20 years. Might have been a shorter period of time. But there's this tremendous mortality rate. And it's mostly in the first 2 years.
Mhm.
And it's mostly due to curable illness
Mm,
because there was no immunity. These were folks who had been born, raised, probably for many generations in North America. So there's no immunity to
mm,
diseases, ordinary diseases that there would have been immunity among the indigenous population in West Africa. And in spite of that tremendous mortality rate, the American Colonization Society forges ahead and continues to send boats. And all they do is they shift the season, so they're not sending boats in the wet season.
mm,
And the
mm,
mentality is, and the way it's written about um, is that these these folks have been Christianized and civilized by the experience of being enslaved by white Christian Americans, right? And therefore, they will have a Christianizing and civilizing
mm.
influence on Africa. And that's why it's called the American Colonization Society, because the idea was actually this is our advanced team in Africa. This is
Yes.
a colonization effort.
Hmm.
It is the levels of inability to recognize the humanity
It's
of
profound.
it's mind blowing. It's mind blowing. And what's interesting about the American Colonization Society is it wasn't officially disbanded until the modern civil rights era in like 1970 or something. So it died down after 1866, after the 14th Amendment was passed and slavery was abolished. Um, it sort of died off, but it didn't actually officially disband for another 100 years. So the ideological foundations of this kind of thinking, the things that hold us back from being a truly multi-ethnic, post-racist, post-colonial society are that deep um,
Hmm.
and that profound. So I don't actually know if I answered your question, but my mind was blown by doing this research.
Well, and
Um,
there's something that you say in this chapter, right, where you're sort of chronicling that history and then also your family coming to ISCJ, but then also visiting a Trenton mosque, right?
Yes, yes.
And you say what important lessons immigrant Muslims could learn from the Black Muslim American experience, I thought, and how impoverished we were and still often are by our failure to see that. So you're not only looking at American history, but then the evolution of American Muslim communities, right, alongside that, right, embedded in that.
Right.
Um, and so how was that for you to, you said like to have your mind blown by the archive of America, and then at the same time think, oh no, there are some implications for who we are as American Muslims. Um,
Absolutely.
how I guess if you could kind of give us again, your sort of retrospective insight about how you're drawing these connections, both racially, ethnically, and religiously. Like, what is that like for you?
So at the same time that I'm writing this, I'm sort of having some eye-opening experiences about my own history as a South Asian, as a Pakistani child of Pakistani immigrants, right? So there are these parallel
Mm-hmm.
sequences of how the British saw South Asians, right, as subhuman,
Mm-hmm.
and what I'm reading, which is just shattering to me. And then I know the story of my own family's migration out of post-colonial chaos in Pakistan, right? What I say in the chapter is that ISCJ was my first experience of what I thought America might want for itself. When I walked into ISCJ for the first time, because it was the first purpose-built mosque in the tri-state, that part of the tri-state area, it's incredibly populous, incredibly diverse. I walked in and it was like being at the Kaaba, like, and I can say that now because subhanAllah, I was there, but like it was every shade of brown and black person,
Mm-hmm.
speaking every imaginable language.
Mm-hmm.
Some white converts, um, also from all over the place. Um, and that experience for me was like, oh, it was the first time I saw actual diversity. Because prior to that time, my experience of diversity was what diversity means in America, which is you go to this neighborhood and it's South Asian, and you go to this neighborhood and it's Black, and you go to this neighborhood and it's Latino,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Latinx, you go to this neighborhood, that's what we mean by diversity. Um, Segregated pockets, right? And this was my first time walking into a room where people were engaged in one activity together and looked completely different and sounded completely different from one another. Um, and I think my parents found out there from talking to people that actually there was a mosque closer to us in Trenton.
Okay.
And so my father was like, well, this is it. Like, we're finally finding masjids. Like, I can finally do what I'm supposed to do for my family and lead them in worship and like give them this identity that is going to help them survive and thrive in the world. I mean, I think it was very lonely for them as immigrant parents. Like a lot of the families we communicated with, that they had some connection to, were half an hour away. And so otherwise, we were like this isolated South Asian community in this sea of Irish and Italian Catholics, in Boslington. And so we went to the Trenton Mosque, and it was as far as I could tell, an entirely African American mosque. And it was so sweet. It was a townhome in Trenton, and there were just kids everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, it was like, wow, this is cool. Do we get to run around too? And but it was a townhome, right? It wasn't a purpose-built mosque. And so there were like it was kind of hard to figure out where, like, what the gender segregation, gender segregation can be very weird for most Muslims, but South Asians are particularly picky about it. And so there was a lot of like, let's figure out where the shoes go and where we go and which kid can go with which adult and all of that. And I think in spite of a positive experience, there was a sense of tribalism that kicked in. There was a sense of like, we like we maybe don't belong here, you know? And one of the things I say in the book is that I think that Trenton itself felt so far removed from this grassy suburban life that my parents were so desperate to carve out for themselves. in
Right.
Bolsington, it felt urban in the way that Hyderabad, Pakistan feels.
Uh-huh.
Like all of the hardships of urban life, all of the
Mm-hmm.
life, all of the, you know, just everything about urban life. And it's the same reason that they weren't in Philadelphia, right? They were in the suburbs because that's the American dream, right? Like that's, people have this feeling of like, that means I'm going to be okay in the end, you
Yes.
know? And I think there was a little bit of like, this is not, this is a little bit scary. I think
Hmm.
it's like not scary, like this is not, maybe we won't achieve this dream. Maybe we're too precarious here. Maybe,
Huh.
maybe we won't make it. And also a feeling of like culturally not knowing where they were,
Hmm.
culturally not being able to bridge it, being too uncomfortable and too precarious in
Yeah.
their own cultural identity to bridge that.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that I actually have a friend that I grew up with whose family made the opposite choice, who
Huh.
ended up going to the Trenton Mosque. They're
Yeah.
South Indian as well. Um, and I think for many of the opposite reasons, like they really saw, they immediately got the politics of the
Mm.
racial segregation of masjids.
Mm-hmm.
Very shortly after that, ISCJ became much more racially segregated, actually. So in it, the initial ISCJ kind of had space for everyone, and you saw
Yeah.
people of every background. And I think after a while, it became overwhelmingly Arab and South Asian.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at least that was my experience of it. I might be wrong about that, but it was actually, I have to say, uncomfortable to revisit that moment because I felt like as I grew into my own politics
Mm-hmm.
and as I connected with more and more Muslims writing about women in Islam, my
Mm-hmm.
heroes like Amina Wadud,
Mm-hmm.
um, those were the women who were saying, we're not going to the back of the bus.
Mm-hmm.
And that was how I felt. That's who, those were women who were saying a generation before me what
Yes.
I felt like I wanted to say in the masjid. Like, don't
Mm.
put us in the back of the bus. This is our home too. We need this place.
Right.
And the problem was that in immigrant masjids, we hadn't had necessarily that same experience of anti-racist struggle. Because
Mm-hmm.
so many of our African American brothers and sisters had already had and had already generationally absorbed the lessons of, so
Right.
that they were not shying away from uncomfortable truths in the
Mm-hmm.
same way that we were. Because I feel like in my parents' generation, there was still that American exceptionalism, still like trying to make it all okay, just trying to make it all okay. Let's have the grass clipped. Let's make it all okay. Let's not like deal with the messy politics of
Mm.
bad city funding and racialized school districts. Let's just
Right.
shh,
Right.
everybody shh. And so for me, that chapter was really unpacking all of that and being like, oh, this is not pretty, you know.
It-
Um,
yeah.
but also saying to myself, like, what a gift. What
Mhm.
a gift that those voices, those Muslim women's voices were there when I most needed them. When I
Mm.
was looking around to say, like, why are we always at the back? There
Right.
was someone saying, let me tell you, sister,
Right.
here's why we're always at the back. You know?
Right. Right.
um, and here's what we can do about it. And so that, you know,
And
that was,
so I get the question that just came to me then is you said your parents read the book and now your daughter read the book twice. Uh, what how do you hold again like both gentleness and empathy for their reasons, right? For your parents' reasons to kind of retreat from that, right? Like this is there's an American dream that we have, that we're desperate for, right?
Yeah.
Like this, we've made this choice and it has to be better, right? Like I have to believe that.
Yeah.
And so when confronted with sort of dissonant information, like information that says this dream, right? Or in the presence of people who will also clearly say, this dream, I might have to tell you a little bit about it. Right?
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a nightmare. And so when you are writing about essentially their decision to withdraw from that, right? That sort of confrontation of what they're dreaming of and then what the reality is, right? As demonstrated through this segregated, right, urban community. How are you holding, right, both empathy for those choices then, and
Mhm.
also now this new knowledge of what it's steeped in?
Well, I mean, I guess after writing A Good Country, it's very clear to me that the machine of American racism is a lot bigger than our personal choices. And that's not to discount personal choices. We make them, some of them are terrible, you know. But my like it's pretty clear that a lot of immigrants to this country are operating in this machine that says if you achieve whiteness, you get all the good stuff. And that's just reality. I would be lying if I said it wasn't, you know? That doesn't mean that it's okay. It means that is the truth on the ground.
Yes.
And so what people are doing is they're coming out of, often fleeing or choosing for hard reasons to come out of their homelands, and what they're hoping for is stability for their kids. And what they are confronted with is a machine that says stability is for whiteness. Stability goes with whiteness.
Yes.
So they make, like, my dad couldn't have found Canada on a map when he immigrated to Canada. So I don't know if I've told you this story before, but everything he knew about North America when he came as a student came out of a reader's, like an old Reader's Digest magazine that his pen pal would send him. And so how he chose University of British Columbia, which is where he did his graduate work. He was studying chemistry. His teacher told him, if you want to do anything more, you have to go out. You have to leave. Nobody in his community had ever left. So he goes
Mm,
to the University of Sin, and they have like these photocopied one-page applications to places. And he's like, I don't know which of these are real. Like, I know nothing about the world.
wow.
And he finds a photocopy of an application to University of British Columbia, and he remembers that he had a professor who went there
Hmm.
at one point and
Some kind of connection.
says to himself, I know it's real and not a scam because that guy went there.
Yes.
And with that amount of knowledge, he got on a plane and like got the first passport probably that anybody in his family had had.
Wow.
And at that time, it was the very beginning of what's known as the brain drain. So Canada was actually paying for these students from Asia to come and study
Mhm.
because they couldn't recruit enough. That was the time of unions, and people could support families with a
Right.
good union job. And so they weren't recruiting a lot of people to these graduate programs, and they needed engineers. And so they were recruiting scientists from Asia.
Yeah.
And so his ability to understand the deep history of American colonization, slavery, genocide, all of those things was deeply compromised because I can tell you Reader's Digest was not covering.
No, not at all.
so so that's where the compassion comes from, right? Because there is a tremendous risk involved in my family isn't from wealth in Pakistan. They're not part of the international elite. There was no access to sort of the story of the world or the realities of the world in that way at that level. And so that's where the compassion comes from, right? Because you take this enormous leap that
Yeah.
changes the lineage of your family forever, the like legacy of your family forever. And if I clung to American exceptionalism to justify my existence, I can only imagine how important it was
Right.
for them to know in their hearts that they made the right decision and that they were able to get
Yeah.
something good for their family. It's a troubled narrative
Right.
because it's all premised on the suppression of brown and black people in America. It is all premised on that, and the
Yes.
extraction of wealth and labor and land.
Hmm.
And I know that deeply, but I also know that my parents could not have known when they came.
Yeah.
And so I imagine, and really for some time after they came, you know, because when you come with 2 suitcases, you're just like, what am I going to eat?
Right. Right. It's needs and
um,
how are we going to survive in this strange place?
so, I guess like everything else, my goal is just to tell the truth about it,
Hmm.
because I think there's something redemptive in just telling the truth about it and saying we're broken. And sometimes we try and we fail. And hopefully, generationally, by telling enough truth over and over again, we begin to see each other, you know,
Yes.
in
Yes.
all of our humanity. And we begin to understand what gifts we are to one another.
Yes.
Tell the whole truth.
Absolutely.
Um, so that's kind of where I ended up in that, in that writing was like, the more cleanly I can tell this truth, the better it is for everyone because we weren't the only family where that
Right.
happened. And I
Right.
think I think what the chapter does is it exposes what I grew up to understand is a major rift in Muslim American communities.
Yes.
Um, yeah,
Yeah. And I'm looking at the time, so I want to fast forward a little bit
yeah,
uh, to some 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 aspects of the chapter when you talk about Chicago. Right. And I was like, I'm here in Chicago. I'm
yeah.
learning things about this place that I now call home. But what struck me in that chapter was both the history of sundown towns, right? And that there are more sundown towns outside of the American South, right? And sundown towns being places in which Black Americans were told explicitly that they should not be there when the sun goes down. Uh,
Mhm.
and so you can give us a little bit more of that history, but I wanted to kind of hover over this this just one sentence because it struck me so. And you said you were talking about visiting a friend, and then one of those friends sort of bring in um, one of their friends, so someone that you don't have a connection to, like a friend of a friend, and he makes some kind of racist joke, right, about shooting Mexicans for sport. Um, but what you how you summarize like the impact of that interaction um, was his words were violent, but his tone was almost jovial,
Mhm.
just very kind of offhand. Um, and then you talk about your husband, and how you're sometimes racialized or ambiguous enough that you're white passing. People aren't really quite sure, but they see your name and they're like, we're trying to figure out, right, your ethnicity, your background. But then when they see your husband, they're very clearly looking at a brown man.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
You wrote, having brought Nadim, your husband, to that table and not left in that moment of clear personal degradation remains a powerful regret. When I think how well trained we are to betray ourselves and each other, to accept the violence directed at brown and Black people in America, I think of that moment of finishing that meal and saying thank you for it.
Mhm.
So I wonder if you could share a
Well,
little
let me
bit.
paint the picture. Like we're in Middle Tennessee. We lived in Chicago, outside of Chicago, and I have a dear, maybe my best friend, college friend, living in Middle Tennessee. She's a goat farmer, Middle Tennessee, and I had a friend in Louisville, Kentucky, and we would often meet in the middle. So we would drive through Indiana,
Mm,
and she would drive up to Kentucky, and would meet in the middle. And what I did not understand was that I was driving through the epicenter of sundown towns. I've researched and cataloged sundown towns in America. Not to say they weren't everywhere in the North, but so what we're talking about is, you know, um, the end of slavery with the abolition of slavery and the 14th passage of the 14th Amendment, you have Reconstruction, and you have this tremendous upsurge of, of, I mean, just like mind-blowing Black excellence, right? You have formerly enslaved people running for public office, buying land, becoming farmers. Like, it is just this shocking, mind-blowing capture of wealth and power. And there's an incredible backlash in
Yes.
the Jim Crow era, right? And all of that is decimated. The levels of lynching go through the roof. The prison industrial complex gets its early start. You have chain gangs. It is just a horrific backlash that gives rise to essentially a forced migration, which is called the Great Migration of just hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of people northward, right? And then there's a backlash to that. There's a northern backlash that is rarely ever discussed. And James Lowen, a sociologist who started at an HBCU in the South, the name of which I'm forgetting, and then ended up at University of Vermont, which, boy, that must have been a sea change. He cataloged that backlash in the North. And the sundown towns and the sundown counties that said, no, don't come here. And just to give you a sense of, and give our participants a sense of how complete that rejection was, he found that by 1970, 70% of the towns with 1,000 or more residents in Illinois were all white by design.
Wow.
And after researching this for most of his career, he felt that whenever you are in an all-white place in America, because there is so much pressure from brown and Black people to find economic niches throughout the country, if you're in an all-white place, it is that way by design. There has at some point been an ordinance or a event or a violent backlash that has made it so. And so if you think about all the towns in Illinois where that must have happened to make that so, it's a profound indictment. The same is true of most of Indiana. And so we're driving from our suburban Chicago home down through Indiana, and we get all the way down. We actually bypass Kentucky and we get all the way down to Tennessee this time because we're all going to be on my friend's farm. And she takes us to have dinner at another hippie farmer's house. And white hippies are supposed to be nice. but I mean, and I'm joking, but what I really want to say is that rural America is a painfully difficult place for brown and Black people so much of the time. Unless you're from a place and you're brown or Black, I mean, all the antennas go up, right? Like, what's gonna happen here? Like, is this okay? Am I okay? Is like so much of the time, right? And I had been able to visit my friend in Tennessee and pass for the most part. Like, I got looks, but because I was with her, often race is by association, right? Like, if you're with enough white people, then you're okay. But I was with my husband, and I was with another friend who's Iranian American. So she was, so there were enough questionable.
Right. Enough questionable identities.
And then her husband had a Mexican accent, although he looks pale like me. There was just too much going on at the table at this hippie farmer's house. And he was blowing a gasket internally. His racial norms, his ideas about what was acceptable and safe and who he would ever host at his table.
Right.
Those ideas were being shaken. And I don't think that my friend understood, who's white, who lives in Tennessee, understood the depth of that disturbance that was being created. Because white hippies are supposed to be nice. You know what I mean? And that is, like, I think unless you have that lived experience of like, just an unexamined whiteness is so often dangerous.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Just unexamined whiteness, because it is so wrought in racist ideas.
Mhm.
Um, and so he thought he was joking. I mean, and he's talking about he's so uncomfortable that what it comes out in is a joke about shooting Mexicans.
Oh.
One of the people at the table was, in fact, Mexican.
Mhm.
Um, and the rest of us could have passed. The other three of us could have passed for Mexican. And that was my friend and her husband and the family that was hosting us. And the table went silent. My Iranian American friend said, well, actually, um, but we didn't disrupt the situation. Nobody got up to leave.
Mm.
And I'd like to think part of that, and this may be some of the discomfort I feel around the Trenton Mosque, but I'd like to believe it was because, we were in rural Tennessee and where were we going to go? And it was this many miles. But the reality is that it's like what you said, like I was not self-actuated enough. Had not come home enough to myself
Yeah.
to say, I have a problem with that,
Mhm.
which is more like what I would say now. Um, and I think that is actually one of the great gifts of having written this book, because having seen it all in one place, I see it a lot more clearly now when it happens.
Right.
And so it was painful, the writing, but the gift it gave me of being able to walk through the world and tell the truth about what I'm seeing is profound. Um, so I always think that I would have done that moment differently, that I would have said, please don't disrespect the people
Yeah.
you know.
And in those moments, sometimes I wonder like how much of it is how pervasive it is,
Mm,
right? That there can be for some of us a level of desensitization, right? It's like
mhm.
we hear the offhand remarks and that unexamined whiteness, which is it can be frightening. It can be very violent, right? In its lack of awareness, right? And when it is sort of pricked in some way, it's disguised by a feeling of like, well, I'm just joking, right? Or, I wouldn't be serious about that. Or like, I think you're a decent person, right? It's cloaked in a lot of sort of caveats
Mm,
that stem from, well, I'm a good person, right? So don't think so ill of me, right? Or think that I intended something malicious, right? When in fact, that's the way it lands, right?
yeah,
And partly what is malicious about it is you have no idea how much power you have, right? In being able to fundamentally change my life because of this offhand remark.
yes, yes, yes.
So
I'm
there's
sure he has long since forgotten the remark he made.
exactly.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
so while we may spend time even all of these years later, right? Like you're recounting it in the book and we're sort of unpacking it here, the person who committed this harm, right? It's a harm, doesn't remember it.
Mhm.
It's just like maybe I said something kind of off or the table went quiet, but I don't remember quite what it was.
Yeah.
And so it's that either disregard or lack of sort of consciousness about the power of those words and what they do to people, or just
Yeah.
not caring, right?
Yeah.
The way the world is structured is to my comfort and benefit, and your presence is disrupting my comfort.
Yes, yes. And what's interesting is that he may not have even understood that Macon County was a sundown county, but that there was an actual moment of expelling
Hmm.
Black people from the county that allowed him that racist
Yes.
comfort, right? That white comfort.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that is the great story of sundown towns, is that white America walks around in these curated
Yes.
white spaces, and they include, the beach towns, and they include most of the farmland, and they include You know, the places with the good schools, and
Yes.
they include suburbs like Levittown, where I went to school, which was designed as an all-white suburb. Um, and we don't understand, white America doesn't understand necessarily how they got there, but they certainly want it to remain how it is.
Yes. Yes.
And then some of white America is actively maintaining it. And then those of us who find ourselves in an America with all of these lines have to make these impossible choices like,
Mm.
do I choose the good school district and racially isolate my child? Or do I choose the crappy school district and get some diversity and my child gets to keep their sense of humanity? Like, what kind of choice is that?
Right. Right.
Um, but those are the realities that are constructed
Hmm.
by this layered history that has come before. And we then get caught in this moment where we have to make impossible choices. Um,
Well, and I think and
over
in making the choices, it's also what we are each socialized to believe, right? So seeing an all-white town, it has good schools, it's like idyllic, right? It's, we have picnics on Saturdays and everybody's like, yeah, I want a piece of that, right?
yes,
But not understanding that, like you said, is carefully curated, right? And meant to sort of maintain this illusion, right? It's like, don't ask questions, just enjoy it. If you're white, right?
yeah.
Just enjoy, right?
And
And
importantly, also, it's extracted economically. That
yes.
could only exist if you're maintaining a, you know, if you're maintaining a $7 an hour working class,
Mm,
disproportionately brown and black folks.
right.
That is how you get the Costco lifestyle, right? Um, that is how you get the McMansions that are affordable to
Hmm.
middle class folks.
Yeah.
Um, and so importantly, like, it's an economic reality too. And it's because it's an economic reality, people are very vicious about maintaining it. Right?
Hmm. So I want before we end to help us understand how you then arrive to Ontario,
Okay.
right? So
Yeah.
you go through these sort of American chapters, but then you also make what I think is another difficult decision, right? And so it's what you can also see happening generationally is that parents are making decisions that they feel are in the best interest of their children, right? It requires sacrifice. It's not always black and white, like this is the good choice, this is the bad choice, right? But I'm weighing options, what is important to us now. And so you decide to leave America. So walk us through like those decisions, right? Especially after having kind of waded through all of this information, these archives, right? And you're seeing your history sort of intertwined, right, in the present. Um, and at some point you decide
So
there's
I actually hadn't done all of this research by the time we made that decision. And a couple of things were happening. One is that I was starting to come to terms with the realities that I do talk about in the book, where the machine is too big.
Hmm.
The machine feels too big for me to make choices that are disruptive enough without a change in without a greater systemic change than I can imagine in this moment and for the foreseeable future.
Okay.
And so as a lawyer, my whole like sort of professional orientation shifts from I can do this work and I will do the good work and it will shift even incrementally
Hmm.
to so that's starting to shift as Trump is saying from the presidential podium, we want a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. And then simultaneously, my daughter, who's at a Montessori charter school, talk about complicated decisions,
Right.
um, and is very ill, like is health wise having some issues. And I'm living in suburban Bucks County, so the color lines like Morrisville is 40% black,
Yeah.
Yardley is like 90% white. You know, like there are some complicated decisions happening on the ground. Um, And she's in this Montessori charter, which has probably the most diversity in the school district of the schools in the school district. But I show up in August and I go to her teachers and I say, one of whom I graduated high school with, because I moved back there specifically to be near my parents.
Yes.
So I show up and I'm looking at this girl that I graduated high school with. She was a cheerleader and I was not. And and I say, you know, I wanted to offer myself as a resource. There's a lot of stuff being said about Muslims. We're the only Muslim family in the school. Come and ask me. I am an open book. I will tell you anything you want to know. No question is a problem for me because I'm worried about my daughter, this little 6-year-old curly headed, you know,
Mhm.
thing in the world that's like a piece of my heart running around independently. And I say, I'm worried because if the election goes the wrong way, things could get really bad. And they look at each other.
Mhm.
And the one who I went to high school with, clearly covering for the other one, says, well, either way, it's going to be a problem. And I go, oh, oh, like, can I leave my 6-year-old child who is ill, you know, like has some chronic health issues with these people out
Yeah.
there? And then fast forward a few months, and I figure out that there's one Muslim teacher who sometimes subs in that classroom. And I say to Jana, it's Ramadan. You can talk to her. You can tell her I'm celebrating Ramadan too. And she
Mm.
does. She comes home and she said, I told her, I told her. And I said, what did she say? And she says, she told me we don't talk about that at school.
Oh my.
And I'm a child who grew up with Holocaust education. You know what
Mhm.
I mean? So for me, if you have to hide your identity at 6 years old, we have trouble. You know
Research.
what I mean? Like if it is dangerous, and I don't think the teacher was saying something mean spirited. I think she was Muslim too, and she was
Trying to protect
keeping a
her.
rush. She was trying to protect her.
Mm.
But I grew up in Felsington across the street from that school, and I know how many guns are in that neighborhood.
Mm.
And I know how many Trump signs are in the window. And I was like, I don't know how to raise a child who can't say who she is safely at 6 years old. I don't know how to do that. And
Mhm.
we don't have enough community in this community to do that.
Mhm.
So this is happening professionally, and I'm questioning the ability to do the good work here. And then this is happening personally.
Yeah.
And then my completely apolitical sister-in-law is calling me going, do you guys have a bug out bag? Like, how are you feeling?
Yeah.
And you and I are talking about how paper clips are not going to cut it here. And I'm going, I need to like re-examine my life.
Oh.
My parents are saying, like, you just moved here. Like, we get to see our grandkids. This is like, we are trying to build the American dream. Do you not understand?
Right.
Like, what have we not communicated to you about this?
Yes.
And in that context, um, we started exploring with my husband's company. I was between contracts, and they were like, we're not exploring. Tell us, do you want to go? Do you not want to go? Because we got to move.
Yeah.
And we were like, okay, okay. It was subhanAllah, like, unless I just opened those doors and was like, this is your path.
Yeah.
And we were not expecting that. So it happened really quickly. And I know it's not the right thing for everyone. But one of the things we did was we really did a lot of research. Like, we wanted to make sure we weren't going from frying pan to fire.
Right. I would have so.
And I'm still not sure that we haven't. You know, it's still a settler colonial society. But if you go to the Canadian Department of Justice website today, there's a statement of the intention of the Canadian government to decolonize. There's a statement that says, you know, that, you know, there's that the history of colonization and the brutalization of Indigenous people was wrong, and
Mm.
that there has to be a truth and reconciliation process in order to create reparation. And they're like, will it ever be enough? I don't know. I don't know how you undo, after writing this book, I don't know how you undo the manifold horrors of colonization. But I look at South Africa and I say, how do people hold the torment that was
Yes.
exacted upon Black bodies, Black people, and move forward? And I've heard Black South African leaders say, we make a decision that there will be no retribution. And we
Mm,
make that decision every day
right.
because we want to move past this. We want there to be another chapter that is
Yes.
not about the cycle of retribution.
Right.
And
Right.
so, as hard as that is, as hard as that is when you read these histories, I don't see another desirable way forward for settler colonial societies.
But that makes me wonder though, it still seems like the onus is on those who have suffered to decide, right? That we will not re-enter into that cycle, right? So there is a moral choice that's being made. There's a spiritual choice, right? It's, you know, what are we gonna do? Eye for an eye until we're all blind? Like, but then if that is the decision that is being made, right, by those who have suffered, what then is the process of accountability for those who have for centuries and, like you said, documented these horrors, right, on Black
Yeah.
and brown?
Yeah.
um how what is the process by which I would say that they purify themselves of that evil? Because it is
An
also
excellent question.
I don't know.
Because spiritually, what is the recovery from that? I mean, certainly an acknowledgement is necessary, right? And we can't even get that far
Right.
in so many ways. So I hear you, and I am often right there with you. I just don't know. And I certainly don't think the South African example has been clean. From what I've heard, there were periods of cars burning in the streets. Um, so I don't think, I mean, I don't think that process can ever be a simple process. But when I look at New Zealand's laws about biculturalism and I see a mix of Indigenous and European New Zealanders doing the haka, and I see a representation that there is an intention to create a single culture in this moment that can be something new. I wonder what else is possible. You know what I mean? Like for me, I look at this, and so Nadim and I talked about going back to Pakistan.
Oh,
And that's really hard because, we were having conversations with family members who were like, you have to know clean drinking water is not guaranteed.
mm,
The destabilization is pretty extreme right
yeah.
now. And that is a hard place to take children back into.
Mhm.
And so it was not an easy, like it wasn't a like, let's just go to Canada. I know a lot of people say that. It was not, I mean, it was a very expensive emotionally and financially, it was a very expensive move. But I feel like I couldn't even, in the context of America, I could not even imagine a conversation at the level of the state about decolonization. Could
Mm,
not imagine it.
yeah.
Could not imagine a Department of Justice that would say colonization was wrong and we owe a debt to the indigenous people. Could
Mm,
not imagine it. It was outside of my dreams.
right.
That's how small my dreams were. And so for me, if I can have the state dreaming small and I can dream bigger than I ever imagined,
Yeah.
like this state is dreaming bigger than this than what I could have imagined before. And here the state is dreaming so much bigger that I feel like it gives me the opportunity to do bigger work and hope bigger. Yeah.
So someone, Sister Najla asked the question, is there a recovery? I would say if you're a truth-seeking person, then maybe there is a chance for change. Sometimes there is no acceptance of the harm that was and is still being done. And I think that's a question about recovery and reparation on so many levels, right? Economically, educationally, right? But also there is this spiritual dimension, right?
Yeah.
Is there a recognition of the harm that is being wrought on people, and that the consequence, the implication of that harm extends to generations, right? I mean, we're still talking about um, what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? And the people who are now, they're over 100 years old,
Yeah, yeah.
who are advocating for this must be spoken of under clear terms, right? And so I think there's a process for those who are harmed and those who have committed harm. But it seems like where the dissonance is the harm is still being done and
Yeah.
not recognized as such. So you have now a president who will bypass Congress,
Yes.
send money and weapons and missiles to a state who is actively involved in ethnic cleansing and genocide. So it's hard to, well, I guess I'll end with this question. After all you've experienced and the research that you've done, what gives you the most hope?
So I'll say two things. One, slightly in answer to what you were saying before, which is that I want to be clear that I'm a materialist in this way. I believe that there need to be land reparations, that there need to be financial monetary reparations, that the endowments of these Ivy League schools that housed the American Colonization Society, that the suburban land tracts, that there need to be deep and thorough reparations of land, of resources, and of intention, that the words need to be said, that this was wrong, that the
Yes.
bodies need to be counted, that the cemeteries need to be reframed and laid to rest where they've been bulldozed. Um, Real steps, tangible steps need to be taken because, you know, that is the foundation for the spiritual
Yes.
rejuvenation, right? Like intention is lovely.
Yes.
There also needs to be action behind the intention, in my mind, for there to be
Mhm.
reconciliation. What gives me hope is every time someone tells a difficult truth against their own interests. And it
Right.
happens every day. And that's how I stay hopeful, is because it happens every day. And so I was reading this beautiful passage in Memories of Muhammad, which Dr. Omid Safi, who's at Duke, who led the Umrah tour that I was on, wrote. He was writing about Karbala and when Imam Hussein was martyred. Um, and he wrote about the Shia interpretation of that event, the spiritual interpretation of it as not having been a defeat, but having been an eternal. I'm not gonna do justice to what he wrote, but an eternal redemption, right? That in standing for justice, to stand against the injustice that was being done to the Prophet ﷺ's family,
Mhm.
had an impact, even if it looked like a failure.
Mm.
That the moment of telling the truth, the moment of standing for truth,
Mhm.
was in and of itself a redemptive act.
Yes.
And so I feel that. I feel it in my soul when I hear, when I hear South African human rights lawyers stand up at the
Mhm.
ICJ, when I heard them last week, um, when I heard them reading the list of claims, that in and of itself was a redemptive act. Now,
Mm.
do I think it makes us whole? I do not think it makes us whole. I think there is so much work left to do to make us whole. But I think we should allow those moments to nourish us spiritually.
I
I
absolutely.
think I think we should allow those moments to remind us that there's this life and the next.
Yes.
And that sometimes we stand for justice here because we believe in the justice of there.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Thank
Inshallah.
you so much. Inshallah. That is such a beautiful way to close. Like it's it's unresolved, right? This is still an ongoing sort of effort of self-awareness, of consciousness, of reconciliation, right, within ourselves. And partly the empathy and compassion you have for your younger self, like, oh my gosh, I should have said something. Why didn't I know? But when we understand that the systems of oppression that operate in our lives do so by making history invisible, right? By making truth invisible, and then leading us to believe that we are somehow at fault, right?
Mm,
Like we're deficient, we're not quite, right? And so, and we internalize that, right?
uh,
If we think about white supremacy and oppression as sort of radioactive elements, we turn off the lights and we all glow in the dark, and we take
yes,
it in.
yes, yes.
And so I think part of the spiritual dimension of wellness is always sort of seeking that repair with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Like
Mm,
you are always greater than, you are almighty, not white supremacy, right? Not these structures that feel permanent or feel that they will always exist this way. No, we trust and rely in you, right? The creator, um, to give us patience, to give us strength, to give us clarity about what
mhm,
could be. And so when we're talking about wellness, it's not just sort of understanding how it manifests as anxiety, right? But also how it works to diminish, right, our sense of connection to something that's all powerful. It is not
mm,
that's all powerful,
yeah,
right?
yes.
So when we have hope in that, there is a possibility, right, that we can't see, but we know that God can and does. Uh,
Mm,
that's also something that gives me hope about what we're seeing today in Gaza.
yeah. And you,
Seeing the
mm,
destruction, but we
yes.
know Allah is greater.
And we hear it in Gazan voices day after day. I mean, subhanAllah, I don't know how, but subhanAllah, the level of faith is
Mhm.
just incredible and so inspiring. And I think it is true that what happens to Gaza is a sort of warning for the rest of us about the work that we need to be doing,
Yes,
um, and how large and powerful our states have become
yes.
beyond our capacity to shift their
Mhm.
power and contain their power, and what that means for us. I mean, I think we all have a lot of work to do for Gaza and for ourselves in the
Yes.
next election
And,
cycle.
and yes, certainly for ourselves, because we're going to see what it means for us to think about, again, the power and the potential of the American Muslim community, right? To speak truth, to understand history, to understand what we're still grappling with internally, and that this all impacts our psychological health, our spiritual health, our physical health, um, and that through it all, right, we are always convinced, right, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that speaking the truth will make us well, right? There's no, I would say existentially, there is no downside to truth telling, right? We may
Mhm.
experience consequences from those in power, et cetera,
Yeah.
but the level of freedom that it affords,
Yes.
right? Just the clarity, just the breath of fresh air, just being able to see things for what they are, and then trusting and believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they can be better, right?
Mhm.
Or that we trust in Him, whatever the outcome may be. There really is no downside. So thank you for joining me. I could speak to you for another hour, but I highly recommend this book. I think it should be taught in high schools. I think that we should be reading it so that we can see ourselves, as Americans, as American Muslims, and as people who have so much. I think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us everything we need. That's always been sort of my perspective. And so when we tell the truth, when we go back to history, when we think about the future, we need examples like a good country that can help reframe those things that we are perhaps afraid to look at, right? And to say, you might feel a twinge of fear, but I can guarantee you that once you speak the truth, you will feel freer,
Mhm.
right? You will be able to reckon with something that is a part of a larger system, but there is an aspect of your story, right, embedded in it. And hopefully, inshallah, I think it can also serve as a way to begin to heal some of the rifts within our community, so that there's understanding, there's empathy, there's compassion, um, and that we, through that healing of the rift, we think about now, what is the call, what is the obligation, right? What is the mandate we have been given, right, as people of the diaspora, right, as people who have been impacted by colonization, by enslavement, by genocide, and we are here, right? And so as you begin with, there is something about stories of migration and exile, right, in our prophetic histories, we embedded in all of our personal histories, migration, exile, right, forced. And so what do we learn, right? How do we use those experiences, um, and mine them for wisdom, right? And deep trust in Allah always. So thank you for being brave enough and vulnerable enough to tell your personal story and that of your parents, and to take us on this journey so we can, again, hopefully with clarity, see where we are for what it is, and that there is power in the truth and how it can transform our lives.
Well,
So
thank you for making a space where it is possible to be this vulnerable and possible to just be in my brokenness, like everybody else, swimming around in it, trying to make meaning, as you so beautifully said, of it. And inshallah, I hope that, that your prayers for this book and your vision for this book will. I hope that it's the blessing that you see in it for other people. Yeah, it certainly was written with that intention and that hope. So I really appreciate you seeing that in it and inviting me to talk to you. And I could talk to you for another hour. So we'll have to do
yes, Leila, thank you so much.
that.
Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.